Last week I had what I can only describe as a nervous breakdown. On Tuesday, the 9th, after the eclipse had come and gone, I stayed in bed all day and scrolled on TikTok watching all these eclipse videos and all these people having their moments and just being absolutely so totally miserable. In a sense, it was like I was sick because I stayed in bed for 4 to 8 hours at any given point. I would get up out of bed and be out of bed at 2 to 4 hours tops and go back to bed, and it just kept bouncing back and forth, back and forth. And it took me a while to realize what was going on. Like, I had basically prepared my whole life for this event, only for it to be an utter wash, $1,000 waste of time or money, time, life, etc. I grew up watching the weather. Like, I would intentionally watch the news for the weather. Troy Dungan for Channel 8 in Dallas, Texas was like the reason I started watching the news. I started watching for the sports later, but specifically I watched for the weather. My sister was born shortly after I started doing that, and on the day that my sister was born, my grandmother gave me a weather book that I had kept for as long as I could remember. I don't have any more because I've moved and so many things since, but that was essentially like my Bible for the longest time. I just kept it and read it over and over and over again. I understood what a cumulonimbus was, and a nimbus cloud, and a cumulonimbus capitalis, and so many other things. And so many other types of clouds have come out since then. But I only know that because living in Texas and the weather being what it was a big deal. But in my youth, I had heard about a solar eclipse. One of my cousins, a cousin who was actually a big influence on me, had talked about how he had burned the solar eclipse, like the partial, into his retina at one point. Later on, when I was living in my grandmother's house when I was about 19, 20 years old, that same cousin came to live at that house as well. And, when he left a little bit after the fact, and he left the series Cosmos, he left Final Fantasy VI, he left like Diablo 2, I think it was, Warcraft 3. He had influenced me at an earlier age when it came to art because he's an artist, and I started drawing because of him. I started drawing more structural type things. I wanted to be like an architect at one point. That was discouraged by my mother, which was unfortunate because she should have probably encouraged me, but she didn't. She doesn't like me, so that's why I don't talk to her. And because of my innate curiosity towards science, or anything really, but mostly science, and my focused curiosity towards meteorology, and then my cousin's influence via the Cosmos series, I decide for my first college class I take astronomy, and I nail it with a 4.0, and that only just cemented my desire to learn more and more, essentially about the sky. And at this point, I don't know about any future solar eclipses, total solar eclipses or anything, because the internet's not really a foundational thing. Wikipedia doesn't really exist, and the kind of internet that I have access to is only dial-up. But through all these influences, later on, in my mid-20s, when I'm still trying to find myself and I'm trying to get over the fact that I've lived in a just neglectful and abusive household, I steer towards astrology to find myself. And I'm still looking at the sky and this new idea. And I spent, with no hyperbole, 2 years religiously, in the very real sense, religiously studying astrology to understand who I am as a person. And it is so strong in the focal point of my life that's really all I was just obsessed with astrology to the point where I basically forgot about all of my other scientific understandings of things, and I only cared about astrology to try to understand who I was as a person. But toward the end of that journey, I found a quote from Carl Sagan that literally changed everything. I'm going to read it to you now. How could the rising of Mars at the moment of my birth affect me then or now? I was born in a closed room. Light from Mars couldn't get in. The only influence of Mars which could affect me was its gravity. But the gravitational influence of the obstetrician was much larger than the gravitational influence of Mars. Mars is a lot more massive, but the obstetrician was a lot closer. That one piece changed everything. It shut it all down. It turned off 2 years of religious delving into myself. And yeah, it made it harder. But at the same time, I understood that a lot better than I could have ever understood in it, because I was still constantly trying to find something about who I was as a person through astrology, but nothing clicked. And that one sentence, paragraph, changed everything. And this was at a point of emotional tumultuousness. While I was living a relatively stable life, I felt lost, anchorless. I felt like I was just constantly adrift, and I could never really, truly understand myself. And honestly, I didn't really start to understand myself until I became homeless. But throughout all of this, I found more and more solace in trying to understand the world around me than trying to understand myself, if that makes any sense. If anything, I started to understand myself the more I understood the things around me. It's only now, while I record this, that perhaps the reason that I felt so crushed after missing that eclipse is because perhaps I would have understood something about myself having this experience that connects so many people, not just now, but also throughout time. The solar eclipse could very well be the point of origin for the word awe, A-W-E, because awe means both wonder and terror. If you think about the people in the past who experienced a solar eclipse not knowing what was happening, to see the sun slowly darken and disappear, to then have this fiery ring in the sky, and for it to disappear after a few minutes, it's no wonder they started sacrificing animals and children and people to appease the sun gods, and them continuing to do so because it worked mere minutes after the fact. We are all searching for meaning in life. And perhaps this just goes back to that 20-year-old kid who is still trying to find that different kind of meaning, but maybe a spiritual meaning to life. I'm not a religious person. I grew up in a religious household, but I looked for purpose and self and identity in religious approaches to things. And yeah, maybe I'm being religious in a sense towards this very rare event. But maybe I'm just looking for self in other things because that's how I found myself. And having put a lot of expectation on this event, yeah, it's my fault. And maybe I'll never find anything. Maybe that's part of why I had this nervous breakdown. And maybe that's why I will continue to look for this thing, because I'm trying to find a reason to live, even though on many days I don't feel like there's a reason to live. And I think that might be the thing that I'm looking for, and the thing that might help me. And it probably won't, but at least it gives me something to look forward to. And if I do happen to experience a total eclipse, I don't know what's going to happen after the fact, but I hope it's something good, you know?